Have you ever wondered what it truly meant to be a man in a palace where only silence was rewarded, where beauty was a burden, and where the emperor's gaze could both elevate and erase you? Not a general, not a scholar, not even a servant in the traditional sense, but something far more delicate, more invisible, more controlled. What if your role was to be present, to please, to never exist outside of the shadows? Tonight, perhaps you are listening in a quiet hour somewhere in Lahore, or London, or maybe New York, lying under a soft blanket with the fan humming above, and your eyelids getting heavier by the minute. Perhaps you're already close to sleep and just need something soft and strange to carry you there. If so, welcome. Please subscribe to our channel so you can always return to this quiet world of forgotten lives and curious corners of history. Tell us, where are you listening from tonight? Because this is not a story you'll find in loud books or war archives. No, this is a story from the silk-covered corridors of ancient China, behind doors so ornate they blurred into dreams, about a figure most history has left unnamed, the male concubine. Tonight, we begin to explore the life of men who were chosen, not for strength, but for silence, who were trained not to speak, but to soothe, whose bodies were shaped to become part of the palace itself, ornament, observer, instrument. In imperial China, particularly during the Ming and Qing dynasties, these men were often recruited young, very young. Many were taken from poor villages, some were surrendered as tribute, and others volunteered in the hope of feeding their families. What followed was a transformation so complete that the boy would disappear and a quiet, gilded ghost would take his place. Their voices were trained to be soft, their steps light, their emotions hidden. They were bathed, powdered, perfumed, and costumed in fabrics finer than anything their mothers had ever touched, but they were not free. The Forbidden City, with its vast courtyards and golden rooftops, held them like insects in amber. Their rooms had no windows, their routines no clocks. Time passed in ceremonial gestures, the folding of robes, the placement of incense, the adjustment of a pillow beside the emperor's chamber. They were often eunuchs, but not always. This depended on dynasty, on region, on the secret rituals of the court. Some were servants in the most literal sense. Others became emotional companions, entertainers, or even political pawns. If they were lucky, they became confidants. If unlucky, they were discarded without a whisper. They were neither slaves nor citizens. They were present and they were hidden. Some spent their entire lives inside palace walls, never once seeing the sky beyond the gardens. At banquets, they were made to stand in formation like art pieces, their expressions soft, their gestures rehearsed. They learned to smile without joy and to nod without thought. Some were beautiful, and beauty itself was dangerous. It attracted attention, envy, and the emperor's passing desire. But desire could be a curse. A glance from the emperor could mean a gift of silks or a silent execution. A line between favor and punishment was thinner than a thread of jade. There are records, soft, secretive, often dismissed, that suggest some of these men became lovers, unofficially, tenderly, silently. They were expected to know how to play the flute, recite poetry, serve tea, and kneel gracefully. They were taught to be perfect company and perfectly forgettable. Their memories were wrapped in protocol. Even grief was a choreographed act. If a fellow concubine was exiled or killed, no one mourned aloud. Their names were often erased. They lived as titles: attendant to the Western Chamber, third-grade companion, keeper of the slippers. Their humanity was dissolved into function. Yet they remembered. One diary fragment smuggled out, and now preserved in a university. Archive describes a male concubine dreaming of his mother's cooking. Rice steamed in a lotus leaf, the sound of chickens in the courtyard. He wrote, "I miss the scent of sweat, not perfumed, one miss being unnoticed. That line alone feels like a soft scream. But even in death, they were not fully released. High-ranking male concubines were often buried beneath the palace trees, marked only by a single stone with no name. Their bodies fed the roots of the empire they served, and the trees grew tall. Some say the trees still whisper. And yet this is only the beginning, because within the palace walls, behind the velvet screens, and beneath the lacquered ceilings, there were rituals that tested the body and the mind. What happened in the bathing chambers? What vows were whispered during the shadowy nighttime ceremonies? Let's turn now to those secret rites, and the soft, scented world where a man could disappear, not from the world, but within it. The bathing chambers were never just for cleansing. They were sanctuaries of ritual, mirrors of hierarchy, and quiet theaters where the body was stripped of both dirt and identity. Imagine it softly, the steam rising in curling spirals, the scent of sandalwood and lotus petals thicken the warm air, silk screens casting delicate shadows on tiled walls. The concubines, male and female alike, were brought in silence. There, steps muffled by woven slippers, their eyes lowered not out of fear, but custom. For the male concubines, these chambers were a daily ceremony of surrender. Attendants, often eunuchs themselves, would gently undress them, folding each layer of silk with reverent precision. Every robe removed was not just fabric, but a layer of autonomy peeled away. Their bodies, regardless of shape, were considered part of the palace's aesthetics, something to be maintained like a garden or vase. The water was warm, not hot. Heat was considered disruptive to the flow of ki, the inner energy. So they sat, neck deep in rose-scented baths, while thin brushes made of bamboo and goat hair swept across their backs, cleansing not just the skin, but in theory, the soul. No words were exchanged. Even the servants knew better than to speak. During this time, one misplaced sentence could be interpreted as irrelevance or worse, gossip. And gossip in the palace was as dangerous as rebellion. After the bath, they were dried with fine linen. Their hair, kept just long enough to be shaped, was combed straight and oiled with cassia and camellia. A delicate powdering followed. Rice flour for the face, crushed pearl for ceremonial days. Sometimes even a faint tint on the lips, should the emperor's tastes lean toward the poetic. They wore belts that had no function except to accentuate the waist, sleeves that trailed like weeping willows, and sometimes anklets made of silk cord, not for sound but softness. The goal was never to seduce directly, but to remain in a state of prepared elegance, like a calligraphy brush set beside parchment, waiting, willing, still. Each concubine learned to breathe without lifting the shoulders, to bow without straying, to smile without movement. And if they were summoned, they never knew when it might happen. It was often in the deep hours of night. A quiet knock, a whisper through the screen. The phrase used was always the same. The dragon desires warmth. That was their cue. The chosen concubine would rise, wash again, light incense at the base of the bed, and enter the emperor's chamber, without a single question. What occurred there was not spoken of, even between concubines. But afterward, they would return to their room, kneel before a small lacquered cabinet, and record the hour in a private log. Some believed this log was read by palace officials. Others thought it was simply a meditative act, a way to keep track of when one existed. Strangely, many male concubines formed secret bonds with one another, silent, coded, deeply emotional. Connections that helped them survive the monotony, the fear, the invisible wounds. They would pass each other subtle signs: a folded fan placed upside down, a thread tied twice around the wrist, a peach blossom left by a door. And sometimes, just sometimes, a hand would brush another during a shared ritual, lingering a second too long, saying without sound, "I see you. I remember you." In one rare record hidden in the archives of a crumbling Buddhist monastery, a monk who once served as palace attendant wrote of a male concubine who wept during the rain. He said the sky could cry, but he could not, the monk recorded. He said his tears belonged to the state. This line haunts the footnotes of forgotten scrolls. Even humor, when it existed, was folded gently into daily rhythms. One concubine was known to mimic the rooster's call each morning in the style of different imperial officials. It made the younger ones giggle, but only behind closed doors. Laughter, if heard, had to be soft. And yet, beneath the surface, darker. Stories curled like smoke beneath a lid. Punishments in the inner court were often psychological. A concubine could be placed on water duty, standing for hours pouring from a jug to a bowl without spilling a drop, just to test obedience. Others were made to sort rice grains by size, a task that took weeks and had no purpose but control. Control. The emperor never needed to lift a hand. The system itself ensured discipline. Some were banished from the inner chambers and made to tend the gardens still inside the palace, but beneath notice. And the gardens were strange too designed, not for beauty, but for memory. Plum trees lined in patterns of poetry, stones arranged to resemble falling stars, ponds that reflected not the sky, but the color of the emperor's mood. The male concubines who walked these paths did so in silence, their feet brushing gravel, their shadows never straying too far. And yet, somehow, they endured. Through ritual, through repetition, through remembering tiny joys, the feel of clean linen, the scent of rain on sandalwood floors, the flicker of a lantern seen through silk. Some even found purpose, tiny as it was, in maintaining grace under pressure, because even in captivity, poise was its kind of rebellion. And so, night after night, they powdered their faces, smoothed their collars, and waited not for freedom, but for a moment to be seen. But the most curious thing? Some of them began to see the palace as their only home. And that brings us to a surprising question. What happened when one of them was granted release? Let's find out what awaited a male concubine once he stepped beyond the red gates for freedom. As you'll soon see, was not always a gift. Freedom, when it came, did not arrive with trumpets or open arms. It came quietly, like a breeze slipping, under a door, almost unnoticed until it had already shifted everything. For a male concubine in ancient China to be dismissed from the palace, whether through age, political reshuffling, favor lost, or a rare act of imperial mercy, was to be thrust back into a world that no longer remembered your name. There was no ceremony, no procession. Often, there was a single document stamped in cinnabar ink, stating that the individual was to leave the forbidden city and not return. Sometimes it was called retirement, sometimes exile, and sometimes cruelly liberation. But what was a man to do after decades spent behind carved sandalwood doors, surrounded by silence, secrets, and silk? Many were already in their 40s or 50s, though some were much younger, cast out after a change in court fashion or an emperor's sudden loss of interest. Their bodies had grown soft from luxury, but rigid from ritual. Their voices, trained for softness, often trembled in the noise of the city. Their eyes squinted in the sunlight, unfamiliar with the sky's raw brightness after so long under painted ceilings and lantern light. And their names, if they had ever been used, felt strange on their tongues. Outside the palace gates, there was no place for them. They could not return to their families, many of whom had long assumed them dead or worse. They could not marry, could not own land, could not speak of where they had been. Some wandered the streets in their old silks, confused by prices in the market. Some sought temples, hoping to find stillness in stone and incense. A few were taken in by brothels, not as workers, but as curiosities silent, delicate figures who sat in corners and poured tea for clients who enjoyed the quietness more than the pleasure, and others simply disappeared. One record from a district near Luyang describes an elderly man who refused to speak, living in a shack near a river, folding paper fans all day and releasing them into the water. Local children called him the Wind Monk. He had no name, no possessions, only a small lacquered box that he opened once each evening, staring at its contents with a look of reverence and grief. No one knew what was inside. Another account from Suzhou tells of a man who opened a school, not of letters or philosophy, but of posture. He taught how to walk with grace, how to serve tea without noise, and how to kneel without shaking. His students never asked him where he had learned such things. They called him Master of Stillness. But not all post-palace stories were peaceful. Some former concubines were captured by traveling troops and turned into stage performers. Ironically, they played the roles of empresses and court officials, their movements so convincing that audiences thought it comedy, not knowing it was truth disguised as farce. A few wrote poems under false names, their verses haunting, filled with references to corridors, whispers, and birds that never sang. One line stands out from an anonymous anthology. I wore the moon as a bracelet, but it burned into my wrist. These men had lived as ghosts, and now they haunted their flesh. But perhaps the strangest stories were those of concubines who begged to return, not because they missed the emperor, but because the world outside was too loud, too cruel, too uncertain. They longed for the predictability of ritual, for the rhythm of silence, for the absence of choice. One former attendant petitioned to re-enter the palace as a servant in the kitchens, just to hear the sound of bells again, to see the lacquered bowls stacked in even rows. His request was denied. He built a shrine outside the eastern wall and spent the rest of his life sweeping the path, hoping someone would remember his name. Most did not, and then there were the letters. Rare forbiddens, usually destroyed upon discovery. Letters sent between former concubines, hidden in scrolls, written in invisible ink, or sewn into the linings of robes. They spoke of dreams, of memories, of smells and textures. I remember the emperor's yawn, one wrote, and how we were trained to respond before it even ended. Another wrote, I missed the sound of water dripping into a jade basin. These were the details no history book could capture. No official record mentioned how they braided their hair on festival days, or how they folded towels into lotus shapes for no reason except beauty. No chronicle told of the quiet panic that arose when a concubine's sash was tied improperly, or the comfort found in shared silence during long winter nights. Even death had no certainty. Some were buried in unmarked graves, others cremated, and scattered. A few were taken in by Buddhist monasteries, allowed to tend to gardens and chant sutras tasks that echoed their old lives, but without the cruelty of performance. They found solace in repetition, in the simplicity of incense and gravel paths. But even there, they were often seen as strange. Too graceful, one monk wrote, like a crane trying to forget how to fly. Yet for all this sorrow, there was a strange resilience. In the margins of old texts, tiny ink smudges suggest that some concubines recorded their histories, not grand narratives, but lists, recipes, patterns. One fragment reads, Day 1, swept chamber. Day 2, repaired fan. Day 3, dreamed of a blue robe. These small notations were acts of survival, proof that they existed, even if only to themselves. And maybe that's all any of us want to leave behind a trace, however quiet. But this part of the story is not yet done. Because the Forbidden City did not just shape the concubines, it changed the world around them. To understand why male concubines were chosen, one must begin not with the concubines themselves, but with the emperor, the son of heaven, the dragon upon the earth, the center around which the entire celestial order was thought to rotate. The emperor of ancient China did not walk like other men, did not sleep like other men, and certainly did not love like other men. His every gesture was layered with ritual, his every glance recorded in the court archives, and his desires, though rarely spoken, shaped the architecture of the palace, the pace of the seasons, even the rhythm of the empire itself. Within, the vast walls of the Forbidden City, where thousands of lives moved in preordained silence, the emperor alone had the privilege of unpredictability. And unpredictability requires control. The emperor was expected to maintain balance between yin and yang, between mercy and strength, between heaven and earth. To do so, he was surrounded by symbols, dragons, jade, phoenixes, gold, and most crucially, people. Every individual near him was selected with precision. The ministers for wisdom, the generals for loyalty, the empress for lineage, and the concubines, well, the concubines for silence. Male concubines in particular played a strange, almost invisible role in that system. They were chosen not just for beauty or grace, but for the absence of political threat. Unlike female concubines, who could bear children and thus entangle the emperor in dynastic complications, male concubines offered companionship without consequence. They were shadows that moved when he moved, mirrors that reflected only what he wished to see. The logic, however twisted by modern standards, was elegant in its way. If the emperor needed emotional intimacy, he could have it without producing heirs that might divide the throne. If he desired aesthetic pleasure, the presence of men trained to embody elegance, soft-spoken, slow-moving, richly adorned provided that, too. And if he needed confession, comfort, or simply company, male concubines were perfect. They had no lineage to exploit him, no family to betray him, and no future beyond the palace. They were loyal because they had nowhere else to go. And so the emperor, lonely at the center of a spinning empire, crafted his inner world with the precision of a calligrapher shaping a character. He chose who would sit beside him during tea, who would read to him at dusk, who would accompany him in the garden of harmonious interests as the plum blossoms began to fall. The male concubines, though few compared to their female counterparts, were strategically positioned. Some served as private musicians, playing the chin with fingers as pale and graceful as bone. Others became storytellers, trained to recite from. The Shijing and Zhuangzi, their voices like water, poured over polished stones. A select few were trusted with secrets political, personal, emotional. These were the confidants, the silent note-takers of the emperor's most human hours. One diary fragment attributed to the Yongzheng emperor refers to the one with the trembling wrist, who was present during a winter illness and held his hand as he drifted in and out of fever. He smelled of camphor and tea, the emperor wrote. I asked him once why he stayed so still, and he said, because I am your warmth when you have none. It is unknown who this concubine was. His name is not preserved. But his presence left a mark. Still, such favor was always dangerous. The closer a concubine came to the emperor, the more fragile his position became. A single look from the empress, a whisper from a jealous minister, or a shift in court alliances could end everything. Male concubines had no formal protection. If accused of impropriety, disloyalty, or even arrogance, they could be dismissed, exiled, or quietly eliminated. There was no defense, no trial. The emperor's trust was the only shield, and it could vanish as quickly as a flame in the wind. Thus, even in favor, they lived in tension. They learned to read the emperor's face better than astrologers read the stars. They memorized the timing of his sighs, the weight of his silences. They adjusted their expressions, not only to please, but to soothe, to calm, to fill the hollowness that power often brings. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, of a male concubine who once corrected the emperor's calligraphy during an evening lesson. Not a harsh correction, merely a tilt of the brush, a suggestion that the left stroke needed more breath. The emperor paused, smiled, said nothing, and next morning the concubine was reassigned to the stables. He remained there for 12 years. He never touched a brush again. And yet, despite this delicate dance, some emperors formed deep, even tender bonds with their male concubines. The Qianlong Emperor, known for his poetry and refined sensibilities, was said to have composed verses for a male attendant who served. "Him tea each evening. You pour," one line reads, "and I am poured into." Again, no name is recorded. Only the gesture remains. This erasure was part of the design. The emperor could not afford to immortalize his attachments. So the male concubines became part of the palace's architecture, functional, beautiful, and fading. Their lives were written in gestures, in tea leaves, in footprints on lacquered floors that were wiped away each morning. But every empire, no matter how meticulously maintained, contains within it the seeds of contradiction. And even the emperor, for all his divine title, was not immune to longing. Some rulers found themselves dependent on their concubines in unexpected ways. They missed their presence during military campaigns, requested their letters while on inspection tours, even commissioned portraits to be hung in private chambers, portraits never shown to court. One emperor, in a moment of weakness, recorded, by a scribe, asked if it was wrong to love someone who could not leave. The scribe did not answer. And so, inside the most powerful room in the world, a man sat alone, surrounded by gold and silence, missing the person who poured his tea. But the palace could not tolerate sentiment for long. Eventually, the emperor would be reminded of duty, of legacy, of heaven's mandate. The concubines would fade back into protocol, and history would continue, yet their imprint lingered, not in grand battles or treaties, but in softer things, the way the emperor turned his cup 3 times before drinking, the pauses he took before speaking, the scent of sandalwood that lingered even after the doors closed. Rebellion in the inner courts of the Forbidden City was never loud. It could not be. Walls listened, floors whispered. Even the wind seemed to carry tales if stirred wrongly. For a male concubine, trained from youth to obey without hesitation, to move without sound, and to think in the folds of someone else's pleasure, defiance had to be folded into elegance, camouflaged inside ritual, and whispered where no one dared listen. But rebellion existed. It shimmered softly beneath the surface of everyday tasks, like a single gold thread stitched into a robe of gray. Imagine a concubine rising before dawn, as was customary, to prepare incense for the emperor's morning meditation. The schedule never changed. Wake, bathe, dress, serve, repeat. But perhaps today, he selects not the expected cedar resin, but a rare incense with bitter notes, one associated with morning, subtly shifting the air in the emperor's chamber. No, words are spoken. No rule is broken. Yet the emperor feels a heaviness and cannot name it. Or imagine another evening, when a concubine places the tea set on the table, just slightly off balance, so the emperor must adjust it himself. A breach so small it could be passed off as tiredness, yet quietly declaring, "I am not invisible." These were not grand acts. They were surviving, and survival, in a system designed to consume, was itself a quiet revolution. The concubines passed, messages in gestures, not letters. A fan closed with a snap instead of a whisper could signal discontent. A sash tied left over right, usually reserved for the dead, might express mourning for a fellow concubine recently vanished. These silent codes became a language of the unheard. They spoke of pain, solidarity, humor, even romance, and only those trained in the rhythms of the court could decipher them. Some used their artistic assignments as subversive tools. Those who were asked to embroider would add extra petals to. Lotus designs one for each friend who had been reassigned, punished, or had simply disappeared. Painters sometimes altered shadows in wall screens, shaping the silhouettes of trees to resemble weeping faces, or hiding small animals, foxes, rabbits, cats in the corners as quiet symbols of the hunted, the tamed, the silent. And then there were the poems. Many male concubines were literate, often taught to recite and compose poetry as part of their education. But their verses, those written not for the emperor, but for each other, remained hidden. Lines were scratched into the undersides of lacquered trays, verses sewn into the linings of pillowcases. One surviving fragment reads, "I am the water you wash from your hands, clear and unremembered." Another ends simply, "I dreamed of red and woke with none." These poems were not acts of rebellion in the traditional sense, but they were assertions of identity. And identity, in a place where names were dissolved into titles, was its kind of protest. Humor, too, became a quiet weapon. In whispered moments after curfew, a concubine might impersonate a favored minister's solemn walk, or recite official proclamations using the high-pitched voice of a palace bird. These moments brought brief, muffled laughter they were never allowed to express in daylight. Sometimes they would stage tiny shadow plays using their hands and oil lamps, telling absurd stories that mimicked the court's routines, in exaggerated, cartoonish forms. One recurring character, passed down like a folktale among generations of concubines, was a foolish emperor who could not distinguish between a phoenix and a chicken, who asked the moon for tea, and who wept when his slippers were misplaced. The subtext was understood. They never performed it for anyone outside their circle. Yet these performances served a vital purpose. They made space for sanity. And sanity, in a world where the color of your sash could dictate your fate, was a scarce and precious thing. Some rebellions were more direct, though still cloaked in elegance. One concubine, known only by the title Attendant of Frosted Steps, once refused to dress in the emperor's chosen color, an act that, on the surface, seemed minor. But in the Forbidden City, color was hierarchy. To wear jade green instead of imperial blue was to challenge the balance. He was punished, yes, given the task of tending the koi ponds alone in winter, barefoot. But he was not broken. And others followed, subtly altering their attire. A missing belt tassel, a shortened sleeve, a different knot. The emperor noticed. He said nothing. But for a time, the court grew quieter, tighter, as though everyone was holding their breath. Then there was food. Some concubines were given the task of preparing dishes for ceremonial events. In these meals, tiny messages would appear, an almond placed where none belonged, a dumpling shaped like a tear. One particularly bold attendant once served a rice cake molded into the shape of a sleeping concubine. It was presented without explanation. The emperor ate it without comment. The message was received. Yet even in rebellion, risk loomed large. The palace had its watcher spies among eunuchs, whispers that turned into punishments. A concubine discovered that exchanging coded gestures might find his quarters reassigned, his tasks changed, and his mirror removed. Yes, his mirror. Because in the Forbidden City, to remove someone's mirror was to erase their reflection, to unname them. But still, the resistance continued. Because even in a world built for obedience, the human spirit curled inward and bloomed in strange places. One concubine grew bonsai trees, clipping them into unnatural yet beautiful shapes. He claimed it was art, but each tree, in its bent trunk and twisted branches, seemed to echo something deeper. A body shaped by forces it could not control. And visitors to the inner gardens, ministers, guests, even other concubines, paused at his trees and stared longer than they realized. Even the emperor once asked, "Why do your trees grow in pain?" The concubine replied softly, "Because they still grow." It was not punished. Not that time. These quiet defiance rituals wove a thread of humanity through the marble floors and jade screens. They reminded those who witnessed them, however subtly, that there were hearts behind the bowed heads, dreams behind the painted eyes. And so the story of rebellion in the male concubine's world was not one of escape or uprising. It was one of endurance, of beauty shaped under pressure, of grace that refused to vanish not in the muted tapestry of the forbidden city, where lives were pressed like petals between pages of ritual. The rarest threads were those of joy, thin, fleeting, and often invisible to the wider world. For the male concubines whose every gesture was dictated by protocol, joy was not a celebration. It did not arrive with drums or lanterns or wine. Instead, it slipped in like dew under a locked door, surprising the skin before the mind had time to react. These men, trained in restraint and silence, learned to find joy not in freedom, but in stillness. Not in laughter, but in the trace of a smile held behind a closed fan. It began often in the early morning. Before the sun fully woke, before the gates of the outer courts groaned open to admit ministers and scrolls, there was a hush, a pocket of time between obligation and observation. In those moments, some concubines would gather in the corners of the palace gardens, hidden between peony hedges or behind stone pagodas. There, under the gray blush of dawn, they would share warmth not spoken, but given in gestures. One might pass a ribbon embroidered with a secret pattern. Another might tuck a folded poem into the sleeve of a friend. Sometimes they merely sat in silence, watching koi flicker beneath the surface of the pond, their mouths making silent rings in the water like questions left unanswered. This, too, was joy. Some found it in the familiar rhythms of daily duties. One concubine, known among his circle as Plum Whisper, took pride in arranging the emperor's scrolls in perfect order, each one dusted with the soft tail of a fox brush, each sealed with a fresh stamp of cinnabar. He hummed quietly, not a tune but a breath repeated, and claimed the scrolls sang back to him when no one listened. Another, who tended to the palace's teaware, named each cup in his mind Moon Eye, Slow Wake, Cracked Star, and remembered which had touched the emperor's lips on which night. He said the cups held memory better than any human. During seasonal festivals, when the palace softened for a day or two, and lanterns were permitted to flicker in hidden halls, the concubines made their observances. They were not permitted to participate in the grand court celebrations, but within their quarters they created private rituals. On the night of the Mid-Autumn Festival, they would share mooncakes in slices so thin you could see light through them, and pass them hand to hand like sacred relics. They'd stare at the moon through open latticework, not speaking, but letting its silver silence settle over their skin. One concubine once whispered, "If the moon sees us, we are not forgotten." Another added, "If we see each other, we still are." Joy also hid in music, though they were often required to play instruments for the emperor or his guests. The concubines had their melodies. After hours, when footsteps faded and the last oil lamps burned low, some would return to the zither, the flute, the reed pipe, not to impress, but to remember. They played not the grand compositions of the court, but childhood songs, or invented tunes that carried no name, no structure, just emotion, shaped into vibration. One concubine, barely 17, crafted a melody so mournful and gentle that listeners wept without knowing why. They called it the room that forgot its window. It was never written down. Others found joy in craftsmanship. They carved tiny animals from peach pits, stitched hidden patterns into hem linings, and wove baskets from garden reeds in designs that mimicked constellations. These creations were rarely kept. Most were given away, traded, or hidden in palace nooks where They might be found long after the maker had been reassigned. A concubine might tuck a carved sparrow beneath a stone bench, or drop a silk flower behind a screen, knowing someone someday might smile upon finding it. Romance, though forbidden, bloomed like moss in shaded corners, slow, soft, and impossible to uproot. The concubines could not declare love, could not write names in letters, could not even risk a shared glance in the wrong hallway. But still, bonds formed. Sometimes they grew from shared rituals, a pair who always folded the emperor's robes together, or who were assigned to light incense at opposite ends of the same room. Other times it was in sickness. When one fell ill, the other would sit by the screen, unseen but present, counting breaths, offering warmth with silence alone. There are stories unconfirmed, whispered like lullabies of two concubines who met only once a year during the New Year lantern hanging, who exchanged messages by folding specific numbers of petals into ceremonial garlands. When one was reassigned to the outer kitchens, the other began placing lotus seeds in his food trays, one for each year missed. Whether the message was ever received, no one knows. Yet the act, repeated, became a kind of vow. Even grooming, that most controlled of duties, sometimes offered small moments of delight. The brush of a comb through hair, the sharing of sandalwood. Oil, the borrowing of a sachet, could be intimate, even sacred. One concubine was known to braid another's hair each evening, though it was not his assignment. He claimed it brought him peace. When asked once why he did it, he replied, "It is the one place my hands do not shake." Laughter, though rare, existed. In shadows, a dropped brush, a mispronounced verse, a bird landing unexpectedly in the garden could spark it. But it had to be held tight, like a bird itself, or it might flutter into danger. So they laughed with their shoulders, with their eyes, with the corners of their lips. And in doing so, they shared something no emperor could command. Even food, though controlled, brought comfort. A particular bean paste, a rice dumpling split in half and shared in secret. A slice of candied lotus root wrapped in cloth and left on a bed mat. These gestures formed a language of kindness. One concubine, whose specialty was herbal tea, once brewed a blend that reminded another of his childhood mountain village. "It smells like the house after rain," the second whispered, almost afraid of his voice. These small recognitions, these moments of being seen and remembered, carried them through endless days of sameness. And sometimes, joy came in memory itself. Not the grand, distant past, but slivers a kite flown once, the feel of mud between, toes, the taste of unpolished rice. These memories, though fading, grounded them. A concubine might close his eyes during a ritual and see his mother's hands folding laundry, or hear his brother's voice calling across a field. He would not cry. That was forbidden. But the memory would stay, a warmth beneath the skin. These hidden joys did not erase the pain. They did not cure the loneliness or undo the erasures, but they made life possible. They made the silence bearable. They stitched gold into the gray. Joy, in the life of a male concubine in ancient China, was not a parade, nor a melody shouted in the courtyards. It was a whisper folded into linen, a glance held 1 second too long, a warm teacup held with both hands before it was passed on. In a palace of silence, where every movement was calculated and every breath was folded into someone else's power, joy had to be invented, smuggled, and disguised. These concubines, though seen by the outer world as ornaments or shadows, found ways to create little islands of peace for themselves, moments that did not belong to the emperor nor history, but only to them. It might begin with something simple, a morning breeze passing through a paper screen, rustling the edge of a robe, just enough to tickle the wrist, and for a moment, that sensation became the entire world. Or perhaps it was the shape of light on polished wood, a slanted golden beam falling just right on the corner of a lacquered table, reminding a man of his grandmother's porch or a summer he barely remembered. Some concubines kept secret names for the rooms they cleaned, naming each corner like a friend. The corridor where the emperor's perfume lingered after an audience, they called it the scented silence. The place near the koi pond where the two had once hidden from the storm, that was the waiting ripple. No one else knew these names, and that was the point. These private maps were stitched inside their minds like embroidered silk hidden beneath plain robes. One man kept a tiny pebble in the hem of his sleeve. He had found it in the garden years ago, shaped vaguely like a sleeping cat, and in times of stress, he would press his thumb to it, grounding himself with the quiet defiance of remembering something useless. Others carved miniature animals from peach pits and tucked them into drawers or roof cracks, little totems left behind like gentle graffiti in a place that pretended they didn't exist. Tea, which was so often part of service, also became a form of resistance and comfort. Each man had his preferences. Chrysanthemum to calm the nerves, puer for grounding, jasmine when melancholy hung too heavy. When allowed to prepare their cups, they chose carefully, not just for taste, but for memory. One concubine, whose family had been tea merchants in the southern mountains, would brew his cup exactly as his mother had taught him. Pour, count to 7, pour again, and always stir counterclockwise. Clockwise. He said the leaves listened better that way. Music, too, was a solace. Though many were trained to play for the emperor's pleasure, some developed private compositions fragments, hummed into the collar of their robes as they dusted scrolls, or arranged cushions. One man carried a tune made of just 3 notes, which he claimed came from the sound of wind brushing against a silk screen on a rainy afternoon. He never wrote it down, never shared it aloud, but it lived in his breath for years. These songs, unsung and unheard, were theirs alone. Friendship so dangerous, so rare also, bloomed in these hidden spaces. A look exchanged across a hallway, a silent nod during morning assembly, a sash folded in a way that said, "I remember. I see you." They found ways to protect each other, sharing extra slippers on cold nights, trading duties when someone fell ill, pretending not to notice when tears appeared on a face in ritual stillness. In one rare case, 2 concubines who had once been trained together from youth were assigned to opposite sides of the palace. They couldn't speak, couldn't write, but they left pressed flowers in a specific spot near the garden of benevolent fragrance. 1 petal meant I'm well, 2 meant I miss you, 3 meant something worse. The petals changed each week. It was a conversation written in fragility. Some joy came from care. One man tended to a patch of moss behind the well, nurturing it like a pet. Another folded cloth napkins into bird shapes before meals, an art no one noticed but him. Yet another embroidered a single silver thread into the hem of his uniform. Each time he had a dream, he never told anyone what the thread counted. But when he looked down, the shimmer reminded him that part of him still traveled beyond the palace. Walls, at least in sleep. They also found comfort in repetition, not the enforced repetition of court routine, but in small, personal rituals. Tapping a comb 3 times before brushing hair, kissing their fingertips before touching the threshold of their room, whispering a name from their past once a day, under their breath, like a spell. These habits became anchors, allowing them to remain themselves, even as the world insisted they become something else. On rare festival days, when the court relaxed, by a thread they found slivers of wonder. Paper lanterns would appear. Sometimes one would float out of reach and hover against the moonlight like a message to no one. On those nights, the concubines would linger near balconies or rooftops, not speaking, just watching, each silently wishing the lantern would carry a thought away. One whispered, "Take my name." Another, take my voice. And sometimes, miraculously, the lantern would tilt and vanish into clouds. Even food could be joyful, not in abundance, but in flavor that pierced the monotony. A ripe persimmon hidden in a robe pocket. A honeyed chestnut left by a grateful cook. One concubine was known for baking tiny sesame cakes shaped like stars. He gave them to no one, but kept one always in his sleeve until it crumbled. Even the idea of sweetness, he once said, is worth carrying. But the deepest joy, though it risked the most, was love. It was not romantic in the usual sense. It was quiet, never spoken, but heavy as stone. Love appeared in the way one concubine adjusted another's collar without permission. In the way they remembered each other's incense preference. In the way they stood near each other, but never too near, never enough to draw suspicion. Some carved initials into the underside of wooden floor panels. Some stitched paired animals, a turtle and a crane, a fish and a butterfly into the linings of ceremonial robes. These symbols meant, I wait for you. I carry your name. I remember. And in a world where no one was allowed to remember them, that was everything. The architecture of forgetting was not built in a day. It was laid brick by brick, rule by rule, breath by breath, until even the walls of the Forbidden City began to behave as though certain people had never walked between them. To be a male concubine in ancient China was to live not only beneath the gaze and rule, but beneath the shadow of erasure. The state did not shout them down, it simply did not write them in. Their names were rarely entered into the imperial records. Their dates of arrival and departure were scribbled in ink that faded faster than any decree. The scrolls that logged daily activity in the inner court might refer to them only as attendant to the southern chamber, or companion third class. No personal names, no birthplaces, no parents recorded. Even in death, many were identified only by their duty or position. It was as though they had never been children, had never belonged to villages, families, or fields. To historians, this has created gaps so large they feel like silence you can step into. But the silence was intentional. It was policy. The imperial palace operated on layers of hierarchy so fine that even memory had a rank. Emperors were remembered in gold leaf, generals in calligraphy, empresses in brocade-covered volumes. But male concubines? Their lives were considered part of the emperor's private world, sacred, hidden, and not for public digestion. To write their stories would be to acknowledge their influence, and to do that would be to open a door too many wanted to keep closed. So the forgetting began while they still lived. Their letters were screened. Their poems, if found, were confiscated or destroyed. The small objects they carved, hairpins, fans, tokens, were collected at the end of each lunar cycle, supposedly for cleaning, but many were burned. Even their rooms were wiped clean when they were reassigned. Mats were rolled, bedding replaced, and incense holders scrubbed so that no scent lingered. The next concubine would enter the same space, unaware of the one who came before, unaware of the sighs once breathed into the pillow or the nights spent staring at the flicker of an oil lamp. This system ensured that no one became a legend, that no single concubine gathered enough mystery or affection to linger in the minds of others. It was a method of memory control, gentle and complete. Yet memory is stubborn, and the human urge to be seen is older than any dynasty. Despite the state's efforts, tiny traces endured. In the margins of prayer books kept by monks who once served the palace, there are scribbles, not full entries, just fragments. He wept when the peach tree bloomed, or he danced with only one foot touching the ground. These lines may mean nothing to the untrained reader, but to the eye that knows the life they describe, they are windows. One line found in A damaged ledger reads simply, "He asked if wind could be trained to stay." That, too, is a name of sorts. There are ceramics bowls, cups, inkstones excavated from sites near the outer walls of the palace that bear inscriptions believed to be from male concubines. Most are brief, coded, or poetic. One bowl has a mark along the base that reads, "For hands that were never held." Another carries a petal-shaped design with a single character inside, "Forget," repeated 7 times, as though writing the word enough times would make it real. These pieces were likely broken on purpose, thrown into pits behind the kitchens, or buried under garden walls. But they remain. Archaeologists today sometimes refer to them as quiet vessels, artifacts of unrecorded sorrow. Some walls, too, refuse to forget. In a lesser-known hall behind the Hall of Celestial Purity, there is a patch of plaster long believed to have been repainted dozens of times. Beneath each layer, faint scratches emerge, lines that seem deliberate, but not fully readable. Some scholars believe these are marks left by fingernails, others that they are coded characters, perhaps a date or a name, or even a poem scratched when no one was looking. One theory suggests they form the pattern of a song, 7 lines, 5 beats, each matching a melody known to have been played only in the inner chambers. But no one can say for sure. Even language forgets. The words used to describe male concubines changed over time, each new dynasty softening or erasing what the previous one had called them. Early terms were specific: inner companion, mourning; attendant, ink-bearer. Later, they became vaguer, those of the interior, the still ones, keepers of harmony. And finally, the terms vanished altogether. In some dynastic records, the entire category of male concubine disappears, replaced with other staff, as if they had become furniture, echoes, or smells in the air. This erasure was not neutral, it was deeply political. To admit their existence was to admit the emotional complexity of the emperor, his desires, his vulnerabilities. And so the empire rewrote him as untouchable, alone but not lonely, attended but not attached. The concubines were incompatible with that image, and so forgotten. Yet, human memory is not bound only to ink. In folk songs sung in certain villages, near the old capitals, there are ballads with strange verses. One song speaks of the boy with silver breath who walked where moonlight feared. Another tells of a dancer whose steps made the emperor forget war. These may be remnants distorted, romanticized, but rooted in truth. Oral memory, unlike written history, carries emotion more than fact. And emotion is harder to erase. There are also tales told by old palace workers' descendants, stories passed down like heirlooms. One speaks of a concubine who planted a pine tree in the garden every year and whispered a name into its bark. When he died, the emperor ordered the trees left standing. Another tells of a man who, during his final bath before reassignment, left a single feather on the edge of the basin. When asked why, he said, "To remember that I was not always trapped in stone." These details were never written down, but they are remembered. And perhaps the most haunting trace of all is the palace itself. The Forbidden City remains. Its bricks are unchanged, its eaves curled like questions, its silence still dense. Visitors walk its courtyards and marvel at its scale, its symmetry. But they do not hear the other echoes, the whispered greetings in the garden, the breath held as silk was smoothed, the quiet laughter in a shuttered room. And yet, if you stand in certain corners at dusk, when the light turns the stone gold and the shadows long, you might feel it, that soft hum beneath the architecture, the presence of lives once pressed so flat they became part of the walls. Even within a palace so meticulously designed to forget, there were always those who remembered quiet figures at the edges of the emperor's vision, men with ink-stained sleeves and cautious hearts, who bent the rules not with revolution, but with reverence. These were the silent archivists of the male concubine's world, scribes who let their brushes pause for a second longer than permitted, artists who let a stroke curve in the shape of a memory, attendants who wrote nothing and yet remembered everything. To work in the court as a recorder or illustrator was to be part of a living mechanism. Each word or image dictated, reviewed, and approved. There was no room for invention, and yet convention found its way in. The scribes, especially those assigned to daily reports and chamber records, often sat in plain rooms with simple desks, their tasks repetitive, documenting arrivals, noting meals served, recording dreams if the emperor spoke them aloud. But now and then, a scribe would break the rhythm. He might add a symbol not required, perhaps a faint flower drawn in the corner of a margin, its petals mimicking the headdress of a specific concubine, or a curve in a character that recalled the shape of a dancer's back. These gestures were not noticed by censors unless they looked too closely. Most didn't, but one scroll from the late Ming period, found in the sealed archives of a provincial monastery, contains several such marks. Each seems random until one turns the page slowly, then a sequence appears. A subtle sketch of a man bowing, and standing, then vanishing. The scribe had an animated absence, and that, perhaps, was his rebellion. Artists, too, participated in this quiet preservation, though most were tasked with portraits of the emperor, empress, and high-ranking ministers. Some were granted access to the inner court to paint festival scenes or create decorative scrolls. In those images, the male concubines appear not as subjects, but as background figures, carrying fans, arranging flowers, preparing tea. Yet their presence is not always accidental. A certain painter from the Yongzheng era, known only by his studio name, Lotus Dust, produced a folding screen that survives in fragments today. It shows a garden scene, nothing unusual, but in each panel, the same figure appears. A man, with downcast eyes, adjusting a sleeve, lifting a tray, kneeling beneath a plum tree. Always slightly different, but always the same. Scholars believe this was not a mistake. It was a portrait rendered in echo, hidden in repetition. The artist was likely a former attendant himself, and this was his way of refusing to let a friend disappear. Some servants recorded what they could in the only medium left to them, memory. These were the men who carried firewood, swept chambers, refilled ink pots, and yet saw more than anyone realized. A few, after retiring from palace service, became monks, retreating into mountains or quiet temples along rivers. In solitude, they began to write not histories, but reflections. One such monk, whose sparse writings are now held in a faded, bamboo-bound volume, wrote only this: "He moved like breath on silk. I never knew his name, but I still remember how he waited for snow to fall before stepping outside." That line, scratched in dull ink with no punctuation, may be the only trace left of a man who once lit incense for the Son of Heaven. Another scribe, perhaps braver or simply more heartbroken, collected poems written by concubines on scraps of fabric and tissue. He sewed them into the lining of his robes and smuggled them out over the years, one piece at a time. His notebook, found buried in a box under loose tiles during a restoration in the 1990s, contains a dozen verses. One reads, "You name me servant, I name myself moon. You pull me close, I hide in my shadow." The scribe did not name himself, but he titled the notebook for those who looked back. Even in fiction, some concubines reappeared. During the Qing dynasty, a short novel circulated secretly among literate courtiers, never printed officially, but passed hand to hand. It told the story of a concubine who could hear the future in the sound of teacups. In each chapter, he tried to warn others of approaching change, but no one listened. In the end, He vanished into the emperor's robes and became part of the fabric. Scholars believe the novel was written by someone inside the court, likely a poet or dramatist who had seen too much. And though the story is fantastical, the feeling behind it is sharp, a desire to preserve the memory of a soul denied permanence. In embroidery, too, memory was preserved. Some tailors stitched secret messages into ceremonial robe symbols that could only be read under certain angles of light, or motifs that referenced personal details known only to one or two. A butterfly with folded wings meant a concubine had been reassigned. A crane missing one leg meant exile. A pine tree with a golden thread through its trunk meant a death unspoken. These were not decorations. They were diaries. Each thread carried a pulse. Even gardeners left their marks. In the stone arrangements near the eastern wall, one pattern repeats across dynasties. 5 stones placed in a shallow arc, flanked by a pair of moss-covered pillars. The design mimics a poem's structure, 5 characters to a line, the most intimate and expressive form in Chinese verse. When asked why the stones were arranged so, one elderly groundskeeper in the 18th century answered only, "They were. Placed like that before me, I only sweep around them." Perhaps the most intimate accounts came from calligraphers assigned to copy imperial decrees. Their brushwork had to be flawless, their characters smooth, consistent, free of flair. But sometimes, in their private practice books, they let the ink flow differently. In one surviving volume, the same character appears over and over. Endure. At first precise, then shakier, then soft, then fading. On the final page, it changes. Dash remember dot 2 strokes added, and the whole meaning turns. These subtle acts of remembrance became a secret religion among the invisible. No altar, no. Prayer, just preservation. A curve of ink, a scent of oil, a gesture held a breath too long. Some archivists believe they were writing not for their own time, but for ours, for someone someday, to find these fragments and listen. Dreams were the only doors that remained unlocked, when all else was protocol, when waking hours were. Governed by silence, precision, and a weight of invisible eye sleep became the sole province of freedom. For the male concubines of ancient China, dreams were not simply echoes of memory or flickers of imagination. They were acts of quiet rebellion, theaters of healing, places where the self could stretch its arms without being seen, where names that had been erased might be spoken again, even if only in the wind. In dreams, they were not attendants, nor silent shadows in brocade. They became children again, running through fields of sesame and wild grass, the scent of earth returning to them as clearly as a long-lost lullaby. One former concubine, whose whispered diary fragments were preserved in a monastery, wrote, "In sleep, I walk barefoot in rain, and it does not stain my silk. No one calls me third rank. They call me son. They call me real. Others dreamed." Of rooms with no ceilings, where the sky arched open like a breath too big to hold. In those skies, birds flew not the ornamental cranes embroidered into cork robes, but real ones, ragged and shrill, carrying letters in their beaks. These birds flew toward mountains the dreamer could never quite reach, always on the edge of waking. Some nights, the concubines dreamed of flight themselves, not graceful like swans, but fluttering like moths, drawn toward candlelight that smelled of home. They flew over rivers and bridges, over distant rooftops, searching for people who had forgotten them. One man, whose duties included folding the emperor's sleeping robes each evening, once confided to a fellow attendant that in his dreams he was a fox with human hands, running through forests of red silk, chased by faceless figures made of smoke. "I always outrun them," he said, "but when I stop, I am still alone." The dreams were not always kind. Some brought sorrow deeper than anything the daylight allowed. In sleep, The concubines sometimes met their mothers again, or the friends they'd left behind, only to realize mid-dream that they had no voice. They would open their mouths and find silence. Or worse, they would speak, but their words came out as ceremonial phrases. Yes, Your Majesty. As you wish, I serve the day and honor the night, and the people in their dreams. Would turn away, unrecognizing? This was the cruelty of erasure, even within rest. But even in these painful dreams, a kind of truth was being processed, softened, carried. One concubine, who was known in the palace for arranging flower bowls with near supernatural delicacy, dreamed each night of a single lotus floating in a bowl. The water changed, sometimes muddy, sometimes clear, sometimes wine, but the flower remained and always opened when he touched it. He believed, perhaps half-jokingly, that this flower was his soul, surviving in another realm where no one could crush it under custom. Some concubines kept dream journals written in invisible ink or scratched into the undersides of drawers. Others memorized their dreams like poems, reciting them to themselves during morning rituals, eyes fixed on incense smoke, letting the images resurface as if they were instructions from another life. In one scroll, fragment found hidden inside the base of a bronze incense burner, a dream is described with astonishing clarity. I am walking in the hall of supreme harmony, but it is flooded with shallow water. All the courtiers are frogs. The emperor is a stone. I kneel, and my reflection kneels back, but it is laughing. The symbols may seem nonsensical, but the feeling is unmistakable displacement, absurdity, a life turned upside down. Another dream passed down in oral retellings among servants tells of a concubine who wandered into the emperor's chamber and found it empty except for a mirror. In the mirror, he saw himself not in court garb, but dressed as a farmer, holding a child's hand, smiling at a woman whose face was lit like firelight. He reached out to touch the glass and woke up with tears on his palms. Some dreams offered more than escape. They offered prophecy, or at least the feeling of insight. One attendant dreamed of the emperor coughing blood long before it occurred. Another dreamed of the forbidden city collapsing like a paper lantern days before a fire broke out in the outer kitchens. While no one officially recognized these visions, word spread quietly among concubines that dreams could be warnings or gifts. And so they began to share them in hushed tones, careful and slow, as if speaking a dream aloud might let it leave the body for good. A few even created rituals around them. If a dream was particularly vivid, a concubine might offer a cup of tea to the moon, letting the steam rise toward the sky as a thank you. If a nightmare haunted the sleeper too often, a hair from the dreamer's head would be wrapped around a peach seed and buried near the garden walls. This was said to confuse the spirits that brought such dreams, sending them chasing after the seed instead. In some cases, shared dreaming became a bond. Two concubines might lie back to back on festival nights, breathing in rhythm, attempting to enter the same dream space. Whether they succeeded is impossible to know, but in the language of the palace, where nothing could be asked directly and nothing could be named aloud, this was as close to shared intimacy as many ever came. One documented instance tells of a concubine who painted his dreams on tiny slips of silk, each the size of a fingernail, and tucked them into the hems of his robes. When he died, these were found stitched into a scroll hidden beneath his bedding 22 miniature paintings, each showing impossible scenes. Fish flying through the throne room, clouds shaped like gates, the emperor asleep on a bed of snow. The final image was simply a door, slightly ajar, with light spilling out. Beneath it, a single character: return. These inner landscapes, while never acknowledged in official documents, became the soul maps of men who were denied everything else. And perhaps it was in dreams that their real selves lived longest. In a world where waking life offered only obedience, where even the act of smiling had to be rehearsed, dreams offered unscripted moments, clumsy, glowing, strange. They offered rooms without corners, bodies without orders, names whispered by. Rivers dot the forbidden city was a world of walls high, red, endlessly patient walls that seemed to watch as much as they enclosed. But even within this architecture of control, there were spaces between the spaces, corridors beneath corridors, paths that only a few knew how to walk. For the male concubines who lived by silence and routine, these secret places became their true geography, a hidden empire carved into the shadows of the imperial one. Most visitors, even most palace staff, never noticed the small doors flush with the wall behind decorative screens, or the narrow staircases hidden behind heavy curtains, or the seemingly ornamental grates near the floor that led to passageways, barely wide enough for one careful body. But the concubines knew they had to. Their lives depended not just on obedience, but on navigation, knowing where to vanish when necessary, how to disappear without leaving, how to move unseen without breaking a single rule. Some of these secret paths were practical. They had been built during earlier dynasties for servants to pass without disturbing rituals, or for guards to slip between chambers quickly. But over generations, these functional spaces became something else. Quiet sanctuaries, escape routes not from the palace, but from visibility. One such passage ran from the southern kitchens to the Hall of Literary Ease, a stone corridor, so narrow that men walked it sideways, their fingertips brushing damp walls. The air was always cool there, even in summer, and it smelled faintly of tea leaves and old paper. Concubines used it to avoid the main paths during shifts, but sometimes, when the weight of attention grew too heavy, they would linger. One man was said to sit there for hours, eyes closed, listening to the footfalls above and imagining them as rain. Another narrow stairwell curved behind the emperor's audience chamber. It led to a forgotten balcony once used by musicians, now abandoned. Concubines who dared would slip up there after hours, hidden by heavy velvet drapes, and watch the moon through latticework. The space was cramped, dusty, and filled with spiderwebs, but it offered a view of the central courtyard, the only place, from which they could see all four corners of the palace at once. One concubine called it the heart's eye. He said it reminded him that no matter how small he felt, the center still existed. Perhaps the most sacred of these hidden places was known among the concubines as the soft hollow. It wasn't marked on any blueprint, and no official ever mentioned it. It was a storage room beneath the floor of the incense hall, originally used to keep winter robes. But over time, it became a refuge. They laid down old mats, tucked small cushions behind support beams, left gifts for one another, dried fruit, folded notes, carved tokens. No one spoke loudly there. Even laughter was breathed out in short puffs, like steam on glass. The soft hollow was where they cried without consequence, where they stitched dreams into silence, where they let their backs touch the floor without fear. To be horizontal in the Forbidden City, outside of sleep or punishment, was a rare thing. And yet here, in this low-ceilinged, dust-mottled chamber, they could close their eyes and feel the earth again. Passageways weren't just stone. They included time, two certain moments off fide, when light bent just so, when guards changed shifts, when the kitchens filled with the scent of vinegar and steam, and everyone was too busy to notice a body moving against the usual current. Some concubines learned to map these temporal gaps as expertly as the physical ones. The hour of duck broth. They called one such window when the aroma of midday soup filled the air so richly that even the watchmen seemed dazed. It lasted 15 minutes, during which a concubine could walk from the western hall to the library without a single pair of eyes rising to greet him. Another safe hour was second bell after moonrise, when the temperature dropped and most of the court retired. During this time, a few brave souls would venture to the outer gardens, not the grand ones, but the servants' plots behind. The stables. There, under the guise of checking medicinal herbs, they would sit among the radish leaves and mint stalks and breathe air that hadn't been warmed by incense or cologne. One described it as remembering how grass sounds when it grows. Not all of these secret paths were known to everyone. Knowledge passed quietly taught by gesture, earned by trust. A tilt of the head might mean, "Don't use that door tonight." A thread tied to a doorknob meant, "I'll meet you in the hollow." If someone disappeared, due to reassignment, exile, or worse, the others would take one final walk through their favorite path, leading behind a sprig of pine or a folded paper crane, as if to say, "Your feet mattered here." Some of the tunnels had personalities. One always echoed, no matter how slowly you walked. Another stayed dry, even during the rainy season. One had a scent like almonds, another like burnt sugar. They became more than stone. They became memory made physical. Even their dangers became familiar. One corridor was known to flood during summer storms. They called it the drowning spine. Yet some still passed through it, water rising to their ankles, just to reach a moment of quiet on the other side. And then there were the near mythical places. The hall without walls, said to be a space between two chambers where sound vanished completely. Or the silver line, a crack in the wall near the laundry basin that let moonlight shine through for exactly 6 minutes each night. Or the whisper stair, which supposedly creaked a different note for every step, and could be used to play melodies if one knew the tune. These places weren't always real, but they were believed in. They were part of the inner mythology concubines built to survive the monotony and control. And perhaps the most poignant hidden path of all was the one imagined, the door that didn't exist, the gate they all dreamed of, a passage out into a world where no one called them by rank, where their names returned like birds in spring, where they could sit with their backs against trees and not be noticed at all. The seasons moved through the forbidden city not with thunder or bloom, but with texture-slow, inevitable shifts in light, in fabric, in the scent of the air that the male concubines came to know more intimately than any calendar. They did not need almanacs. Their bodies could read the passing of time through the rhythm of tasks, the way wind moved through silk screens, or how their footsteps echoed differently on a cold floor. Autumn, when it arrived, brought with it the smell of roasted chestnuts from distant kitchens and the faint rustle of yellowed ginkgo leaves gathering near the courtyard steps. The robes grew heavier, lined with rabbit fur around the collar. The water used for washing was no longer drawn from the morning well, but warmed in kettles first, poured with extra care to avoid startling the skin. It was during this season that the concubines became most reflective, their gestures slower, their eyes lingering on the sky as it paled earlier each evening. They said autumn was the time when memories clung more stubbornly, like the last leaf refusing to fall. Some concubines would walk the long stone paths behind the main library, heads bowed not in fear but in thought, trailing fingers along the old garden walls, murmuring half poems that no one else could hear. It was also the time of the chrysanthemum festival, when flowers were arranged not only in vases, but in the hair and sleeves of higher-ranking court women. The male concubines, though not officially allowed to partake, created their own traditions, slipping fallen petals into their slippers for luck, hiding tiny blossoms inside sleeves to leave as gifts for others, or floating them in bowls of water, like silent paper boats that carried unspoken wishes. Winter came quietly, but bit deeply. The palace seemed to contract under the cold, hallways more hushed, breath visible in soft curls. The floor chilled through even the thickest salls, and the oil lamps burned longer each night. For the concubines, Winter brought a strange clarity, fewer distractions, fewer shifts in color or duty. It was a time of conserving energy and of repetition. They became experts at layering, linen, cotton, silk, fur, each tied with precision, so that nothing moved out of place. Tasks were done with gloved hands, even tea pouring, and it was in these cold months that some of the deepest bonds formed between them, not through touch, but proximity. They would sit closer on benches, pass warmed stones back and forth in silence, and share steam from a single pot of chrysanthemum broth. When snow finally fell, they were not allowed to marvel openly, but they watched. They memorized the patterns. Snowflakes left on railings, the softness with which the rooftops turned white, the silence that even the emperor's footmen respected. One concubine is said to have whispered to another, "Snow is the only thing in this place that forgets rank." In secret moments, they left their footprints side by side in the untouched corners of the inner garden, then watched as fresh flakes covered even those traces. Spring, however, brought a trembling tension. Though celebrated outwardly with plum blossoms and lacquered parasols, within the concubine quarters, it was a season of unpredictability. With warmth came change, new arrivals, shifts in preference, the beginning of reassignment lists. Faces changed. Some disappeared without explanation. Rooms were emptied, belongings quietly folded and burned or repurposed. The concubines called it the season of vanishing. It was also the time of fresh cosmetics, thinner fabrics, and increased ceremonial duties, all of which reminded the concubines that they were, above all, ornaments first. But in this vulnerability came awareness, a hypersensitivity to sound, to light, to the tiny changes in how their names were called, or how a steward folded their sleeve. Spring was also when Forbidden's feelings stirred more easily. The air smelled of jasmine and damp earth. Robes rustled more freely. Eyes met more often, briefly. Hidden notes reappeared, pressed into slippers, tucked beneath tea trays, or folded into peach blossoms. It was a time of risk and awakening, and also a time of heartbreak. For every new affection found, another was lost. One concubine is remembered for writing a single line on his chamber wall during spring. The air returned, but you did not. And then came summer, bright, stifling, endless. The heat soaked into every surface, making even stone feel like it breathed. The silk clung to the skin, and sleep came in bursts. A palace buzzed with insects and low murmurs. During the hottest months, the concubines were allowed to rest more during daylight, but were expected to serve longer into the night, when the emperor stayed awake with cold tea and fans. The concubines became ghost-like in those hours, gliding between rooms barefoot, robes damp, carrying chilled fruit or perfumed water. Sleep deprivation became. And yet summer also brought strange softness. Lanterns stayed lit for longer. The rules slackened, if only slightly. They were allowed to bathe more often. Some even received silk fans as gifts, not from the emperor, but from each other. One concubine embroidered a constellation onto his fan and passed it along without explanation. It was understood. Others wrote poetry in sweat, drawing verses on each other's backs with fingertips, letting them vanish before being completed. In the thick heat, time blurred. It was easy to forget which day it was, and so the concubines learned to measure time by fruit. Lychee meant early summer, melon meant peak, and lotus seed soup meant the tail end, when the air grew heavier before yielding to autumn once more. Through all seasons, the concubines lived as barometers of emotional weather-reading moods like clouds, adjusting their tone like a breeze. But they never forgot the way each season touched them differently. In winter, they whispered deeper. In summer, they moved more slowly. In autumn, they dreamed longer. And in spring, they risked everything. Life inside the palace was not lived in hours or days, but in ritual's unspoken scripts that shaped every blink, breath, and bow of the male concubines who moved like silk through the corridors of the Forbidden City. Time was not counted in bells alone, but in sequences of gestures, each one practiced until it dissolved into the body's memory. There were rituals for waking, rituals for folding robes, rituals for preparing tea, and rituals for waiting. Even waiting had choreography. It was not enough to be still. One had to be still in the correct direction, with the hands placed just so, and the gaze lowered at the precise angle that signified readiness without demand. From the moment a boy began his training as a concubine, ritual was stitched into him like thread into brocade. He was taught how to kneel in silence for long durations without shifting. He was shown how to bow from the waist or from the knees, depending on the rank of the observer. He learned the weight of pause, how long to wait after the emperor spoke. Before replying, how to close a door without letting the latch click, how to nod without seeming presumptuous. These small things were not decorative, they were serving. Ritual was a language, and one wrong syllable could cost everything. Morning rituals began in shadow. Before the sun rose, the concubines were already preparing for the day, not for themselves, but for the emperor's awakening. Their first duty was quiet cleansing. Water warmed to exact temperatures was poured into shallow bowls, mixed with powdered lotus root or crushed magnolia. The face was wiped gently, not to disturb. The skin's softness. Hair was combed and oiled, usually by another concubine, in silence. Clothing was layered slowly. Linen closest to the body, then cotton, then silk, tied with specific knots, each knot a sentence. A loop folded under meant humility. A knot facing outward was used on festival days. The sash was always tightened after the final bell, never before. Then came the incense ritual. Each concubine was assigned a section of the chamber or hall. They lit the stick from a central flame, carried in by the lid steward, and moved clockwise around the space, letting the smoke drift in loops. They did not speak. They breathed slowly, and the rhythm of their steps was set by the count of the incense coils. It was said that if one walked too fast, the emperor's mood would sour before noon. If the smoke curled flat, the day would be peaceful. If it scattered, storm-soft weather or politics were expected. The rituals of greeting were even more intricate. If summoned to appear before the emperor, the concubine would first be announced by a steward, then allowed to enter only when the emperor's finger tapped twice on his tea bowl. Upon entry, the concubine would lower his gaze, bow once, and step forward no more than 5 paces. He would speak only if addressed, and even then, use the lowest register of his voice. Many developed a tone so soft it was described as speech, stitched into air. Gifts were presented with both hands, sleeves pulled back just enough to show sincerity, but not so far as to appear assertive. Tea was poured in 3 steps. Pour, pause, pour again. Each movement curved like calligraphy. But perhaps the most haunting rituals were those of grief. Though concubines were expected to remain composed, even in the face of personal loss, there existed a hidden vocabulary of mourning, passed down through generations of attendants. If a fellow concubine disappeared, whether through reassignment, death, or quiet exile, the others could not ask. To ask was to challenge authority, but they could mourn. They did so in a gesture. A brush was left on a shelf for 3 days. A bowl filled only halfway. Hair tied with a thread of white rather than silk. One ritual involved standing beside a window at dawn and placing the right palm flat against the lattice, facing east. Holding still, the sun struck the wrist. It was called inviting absence. No words were spoken, but the message rippled. The concubines also had private rituals for anniversaries. Though no one dared mark dates aloud, they remembered. One man folded a paper bird each year on the bough, Night, his closest companion, had been dismissed. He kept the birds hidden in a silk pouch inside his pillow. Another stopped eating mango for an entire season after his friend, who adored the fruit, vanished from their shared duties. These quiet acts were not defiance, they were devotion. During imperial ceremonies, when the emperor appeared in full regalia and the entire court stood like a painted scroll, the concubines became part of the scenery, frozen yet charged with energy. They stood in designated places, holding objects, or scrolls or fans, each according to their role. But even here, ritual guided them. The way they blinked, the direction of their breath, the distance between their feet, all of it choreographed. It was said that a concubine's tears, if they fell during a seasonal offering, were taken as signs from heaven. And so they learned to cry without falling apart, to let tears collect in the lower lash line but never fall, to absorb grief into posture. Ritual extended into dreams. Before sleeping, some concubines lit a single stick of sandalwood incense and placed a copper coin beside their pillow, not for fortune, but to anchor memory. If they dreamed of water, they would cup their palms under their chin the next morning and whisper a name into the hollow space. If they dreamed of fire, they would avoid eye contact for the day. These customs were not written, but they were known. They formed a secret liturgy, a floating scripture that lived only in behavior. Even joy had its rituals. A shared glance was followed by a bowed head. A gift exchanged was never acknowledged directly, but returned with an object of equal softness, an embroidered thread, a pebble, a folded fan. One concubine described his world as a garden where emotion bloomed without petals, in a life where words were policed and memories were not allowed to take root. The male concubines of the Forbidden City found other ways to remember. They became quiet archivists of their own existence, not through scrolls or ink, but through thread, fold, line, and shadow. Memory became a tactile craft, hidden inside the mundane, stitched into the everyday. Each concubine, whether consciously or instinctively, learned to shape his inner world through creation, silent, symbolic, and often impermanent. Their histories could not be spoken aloud, so they were folded into the soft bones of things. A knot, a cuff, a crease in the bedding. One of the most intimate forms of preservation was embroidery. Though officially their needlework was reserved for the emperor's robes or decorative court items, concubines used their own time, often late at night or in private, to create miniature pieces never meant for display. On scraps of discarded silk or linen, they stitched small, coded emblems. A heron with broken wings to represent someone exiled. A branch with 7 buds for 7 years of waiting. A gourd split in 2 for a friendship forcibly ended. Colors were chosen not for beauty, but meaning. Indigo meant longing. Silver was regret. Yellow, ironically, the imperial hue, was rarely used in these secret pieces. It represented danger. Many of these embroidered works were never completed. That, too, was intentional. Leaving the final stitch undone was a way of saying, this story is still becoming. Others stitched onto the insides of their sleeves, hidden from view, but always close to the skin. These pieces were not preserved in museums. They were worn, slept in, lost, or quietly burned when someone disappeared. But some fragments remained, pressed into the lining of boxes or tucked beneath drawers, found centuries later, bearing a language only the forgotten could understand. Knots, too, became memory. In the palace, tying a knot was not merely functional. It was ritual, rhythm, and restraint. The way a sash was wrapped, the direction of its fold, the number of loops, all were deliberate. Concubines created private, knotting patterns to represent certain people or moments. A double loop with a hidden twist meant shared laughter. A square knot left loose meant grief. Some created tiny cords of knotted thread and hung them under tables or beds little garlands of days remembered. One concubine was known for carrying a strand of red silk with 12 knots, each one representing a day spent in the garden with. Another he was never allowed to name. He would undo one knot each month, as if unraveling time. When the thread was gone, he began again. Even paper became sacred. Shadow puppets, usually associated with village plays and temple festivals, were forbidden in the court's inner chambers. But some concubines, especially those with rural origins, revived the art in secret. Using scraps of parchment or soft leather, they carved small silhouettes. Birds in mid-flight, figures dancing, animals curled in sleep. These were not performed publicly. They were held up to candlelight against a wall where the moving shadows became private theaters of memory. One concubine is said to have created an entire cast of characters to represent his former village. Each night, before sleep, he would move them across the wall with a thin reed, whispering their names. He did this for years. When he was transferred to another wing, the puppets vanished, but his candle was found, the wax still holding the impression of a bird's wing. Fans were another medium. While fans served practical purposes in the summer heat, many concubines personalized them in ways that escaped notice. On the reverse side, they painted scenes invisible at first glance. A pavilion with one empty chair, a boat adrift with no oar, a tree half bloomed, half barren. These were not decorations. They were inner landscapes. Fans folded and unfolded like lungs, and the act of fanning became not just comfort, but remembrance. Some wrote single characters along the edge where only the hand would feel them. Names, verbs, fragments of songs. One surviving fan discovered in the palace archive bore the word wait written 16 times along the ribbing. It was only visible when light passed through it just so. Some concubines worked in ink, but secretly. Since writing was monitored closely, those who dared preserved their thoughts in brush practice sheets, claiming they were rehearsing calligraphy. But within those pages, repeated characters would occasionally distort into poems. A line would start as sky and evolve into silent. River would become return. Sometimes entire verses could be found in the curvatures of supposed practice drills. One scroll, believed to have been hidden in the base of a cabinet, was discovered generations later behind a loose brick. It read, "I was never meant to be remembered, but I remember myself, in lines that curl like breath." Objects, too, became repositories of memory. A chipped balisust each morning, a comb with a broken tooth. A mirror was deliberately smudged on one side so that the reflection was never whole. These were not accidents. They were chosen, kept, and infused with presence. In a place where so much was ephemeral and controlled, the act of holding on to an imperfect object was a declaration. I have touched something real. Even scent became part of this quiet record-keeping. Concubines often blended their own oils combinations of clove, rose, plum, pine knot to wear publicly, but to mark their bedding, their letters, their spaces. These scents, unique and homemade, lingered long after the person was gone. A chamber might carry the memory of someone for weeks through a faint trace on a pillow or curtain. One attendant once described entering a vacant room and knowing exactly who had lived there, because the scent of camphor and yuzu still hummed in the air like a farewell. All of these acts, stitching, carving, knotting, blending, were forms of quiet defiance. In a world that demanded they leave no trace, the concubines left thousands. Not loud, not obvious, but persistent. Hidden in folds, cracks, shadows. Preserved not for the emperor, not for historians, but for the self. For the dignity of saying, I was here. I felt something. Music in the Forbidden City was never just sound, is structure, control, a polished mirror in which the emperor saw the shape of heaven reflected back at him. Every court performance, every pluck of the chin or trembling of the pipa, was choreographed with the precision of stars rotating above the hall of supreme harmony. And yet, beneath all this celestial order, in the quiet spaces where male concubines lived and moved, there existed another kind of music, softer, hidden, personal. Not for ceremony, not for praise, but for presence. For staying sane in a world that demanded they disappear. From a young age, concubines were trained in at least one instrument. The goal was to offer elegance to the imperial household, to bring harmony into the emperor's chambers. Some learned the guzheng, with its dozens of strings stretched like delicate nerves across lacquered wood. Others studied the dizzy, the bamboo flute whose breathy sound was said to echo sorrow more purely than speech. But outside the formal sessions, when the lanterns were dim and the attendants asleep, they made music differently. One concubine, known among his peers as Reed Whisper, had a habit of playing the same 3 notes on his xiao every evening before sleep. He called them his invisible lullaby. The notes were so soft, barely audible, but those in the nearby chambers began to expect them, and over time, they described feeling unsettled on nights when the melody did not appear. It wasn't a song in the traditional sense, it was a signal, a breath shared across walls. Others didn't play at all, but hummed. Humming was safer, less conspicuous. A vibration in the chest, a sound that didn't require permission. These melodies were never written down, had no titles. They were shaped by memory snippets of folk tunes from forgotten villages, rhythms remembered from childhood lullabies, or entirely improvised. Tones that followed the pace of their own heartbeat. Humming became a secret code, sometimes layered with meaning. A rising tone at the end might indicate hope. A flat phrase repeated 3 times might mean grief. Some concubines would hum in harmony when crossing paths in corridors, their voices never overlapping directly, but flowing around one another like birds on separate currents. One of the more haunting forms of musical memory came in the form of tapping. When instruments were forbidden or unavailable, concubines used their fingers on stone, wood, or even water. They tapped rhythms onto the edge of trays, tapped patterns into wash basins, tapped sequences onto their own thighs beneath their robes. These patterns were often meditative. 5 soft taps followed by a pause, then 3 more. Some said it helped them breathe more evenly. Others claimed the rhythm reminded them they still had control over something, however small. During punishments, where speaking was banned and eye contact forbidden, some concubines would comfort one another through these taps. A single beat against a shared wall. A coded sequence on the rim of a shared bowl. Entire conversations were carried this way, without a word spoken. And silence, too, became music. In a place so filled with constant ceremonial sound, the shuffling of slippers, that clinking of porcelain, the rustling of silk, true silence stood out. It was rare and sacred. Concubines sometimes gathered in silence, not because they had nothing to say, but because the absence of noise was itself a kind of song. They would sit in a shared chamber, backs against the same wall, breathing in unison, creating a slow rhythm that needed no melody. They called it breathing the same sky. Others found music in repetition, the steady motion of folding robes, the splash of water against basin stone, the soft rattle of tea leaves poured from jar to cup. One concubine described his morning sweeping ritual as playing a horizontal harp, each stroke of the broom a note in a private symphony no one else could hear. These private concerts were not recorded, not remembered by history, and yet they lingered. A concubine's fingers, trained in precision, often carried melodies long after the sound faded. Some would trace invisible notes into the air while they waited in the shadows of the throne room. Others would drum their fingers on their own ribs, quietly, slowly, as if coaxing comfort from within. The rarest and most intimate musical act of all was singing in sleep. On occasion, a concubine would begin to murmur a tune while dreaming. The sound would rise like mist from his bedmat, thin and tremulous, sometimes wordless, sometimes repeating a single phrase, perhaps a name, perhaps a prayer. Others in the room would pretend not to hear. They would hold their breath and listen, letting the dream song pass over them like wind through tall grass. No one ever spoke of it in the morning. That, too, was ritual. Instruments crafted by the other. Concubines themselves were sometimes discovered, hidden in cracks or behind furniture. Flutes made from reed pens, drums fashioned from tea canisters, stringed things with thread and hair, pulled taut over lacquer boxes. These were not beautiful in the official sense. They were not for performance, but they were played with reverence. And when one concubine disappeared, the others would sometimes play a single note from his instrument, if found, before letting it be dismantled. It was their funeral bell. In a courtyard once used by the emperor's entertainers, moss now grows where dancers once stepped, but in one corner, barely visible. In the brick are 3 parallel lines said to represent the strings of a zither. No one knows who carved them, but some say that if you sit there just before dawn, the stone feels warm, and if you close your eyes, you might hear a note that doesn't belong to the wind. Disappearance in the palace was never sudden not to. Those who paid attention, it came like mist creeping under a door, invisible until you are already wet with its chill. For male concubines in the Forbidden City, to vanish was not always to die, but it was always to be unspooled from the fabric of court life, so carefully that, within days, it seemed as though they had never been there at all. No alarms were raised. No farewells were offered. They simply stopped appearing at breakfast duty, stopped crossing the corridor at dusk, and stopped humming while folding sheets. Their absence echoed softly, in places most people did not look. The rituals of disappearance were practiced by the system, but understood most intimately by the concubines themselves. They knew the signs before they were told. A change in duties. A chamber door was left ajar. A robe not retrieved from the laundry. Even the scent of a certain incense used only during reassignment was enough to send ripples through the quiet world of their quarters. It was not fear that came first, but a stillness, like the air before snowfall. Once the process began, the removal was gentle in action, but brutal in consequence. A steward would arrive during the day with a folded notice, never read aloud. The concubine receiving it would bow, acknowledge, and continue his task until dismissed. No one asked where he would go. No one asked why. Often, they didn't even dare exchange glances. To do so might invite the same fate. If permitted, the concubine would return to his chamber briefly. There, he had only moments to collect what few belongings were truly his, perhaps a comb, a handkerchief, a scrap of embroidery. Anything too personal, too strange, or too sentimental would be left behind or destroyed. In some cases, fellow concubines were permitted to assist in the packing, but never to speak. They would fold garments with mechanical grace, hands touching briefly, intentionally, as a final kindness. Sometimes, a flower was pressed into the departing man's palm without eye contact. Sometimes, a silent bow replaced words too dangerous to share. The actual departure was always arranged for late night or early dawn. The palace's less traveled corridors would be cleared. 1 or 2 eunuchs would escort the concubine through service routes, avoiding the main halls. He would not see the emperor, nor pass the rooms where he once worked. It was said that the walls absorbed the sound of those steps, as if ashamed of their loss. And once the concubine passed the final threshold, through a door known among the inner circle as the Whisper Gate, he ceased to exist within the palace records. His name was scratched out. His duty was assigned. His room cleaned, reoccupied, renamed, but those left behind remembered. Their mourning had no shrine, no incense, no official hour. It lived in gestures, in absences. The first bowl of tea after a disappearance was poured more slowly, and the cup was left untouched for a full minute before anyone drank. This was called ghost steeping. It honored the vanished by giving their memory time to rise like steam and fade into the room. Some concubines folded an extra towel each morning, knowing it would not be used. Others tucked tiny paper animals under pillows or behind screens, naming them silently after the ones who'd gone. A single sandal was left in the corner. A robe hung with the wrong knot. A fan turned face down. These became symbols, read only by those who knew the quiet language of loss. Music changed, too. A melody that once echoed softly between two companions might go silent for weeks. Humming would stop. Flute notes would become shorter. In the bathing chambers, where water once carried whispers and songs, silence would settle like a shroud. Even scents began to shift. One concubine was known for blending a specific oil sandalwood, rose, and a hint of clove. After he vanished, others refused to use that scent for a year. When it returned, it was diluted, out of respect. Some concubines, particularly those who'd shared emotional ties with the departed, created rituals of their own. One carved a the line into the wooden beam above his bed for each friend lost, calling it the ceiling of stars. Another, more daring, embroidered the names of 5 vanished concubines into the hem of a ceremonial robe, using only one thread so fine that it looked like a crease. He wore it often, even in the emperor's presence. He was never caught. The greatest fear among the concubines was not physical punishment or hardship. It was being forgotten. And so, they developed methods of remembering that resisted erasure. One story tells of a man who, upon learning that his closest friend was to be reassigned to the outer provinces, carved a single character, to remember, into the back of a brush handle and slipped it into his friend's satchel. When the friend returned years later as a kitchen steward, he still carried the brush. The carving had faded, but not disappeared. There were also songs never sung aloud, but hummed or played quietly on tea trays and basin rims tunes associated with those who had vanished. When such a melody was played, those who knew it would pause mid-task, bow their heads slightly, and let the memory pass through them. Even the guards, if they noticed, turned away. Sometimes, no rituals followed a disappearance. Some concubines vanished who had kept to themselves, who had spoken little, who had touched no one too closely. Their absence echoed differently, a softer silence, an unclaimed emptiness. Yet even these were remembered. Someone would sweep their corner more carefully. Someone would take up their old duties with a little more reverence. In the world of the concubines, everyone left something behind. The palace did not like these traces. It did everything it could to smooth them out, repainting rooms, removing objects, reassigning schedules. But memory was not kept in objects alone. It lingered in gesture, in breath, in muscle. Those who remained carried the vanished with them. In posture, in silence, in the small, careful ways they resisted forgetting. In a life shaped by routine and silence, where every waking hour belonged to someone else. The male concubines of the Forbidden City turned inward to find freedom, and often that meant looking beyond the body. The spiritual world, though never discussed openly, was alive in the margins of their days, flickering in lamp smoke, whispering behind curtains, breathing between the cracks in stone. They were not priests, nor monks, nor scholars, but they were believers quietly, privately, sometimes desperately. And what they believed was not always written in doctrine. Their afterlives were not imagined in lines of text, but in folds of cloth, in dreams, in the way a breeze touched the back of the neck without explanation. The palace, with all its grandeur, had very little room for religion, at least for those in the lowest tiers. While the emperor made ritual offerings to heaven and earth, and official ceremonies honored ancestors with strict pageantry, the concubines were expected only to observe, never to participate. They watched from a distance as incense curled toward Thesky, as chants echoed through marble halls, but their own dead were not named. No one lit lanterns for a vanished concubine. No one burned joss paper in his name. And so they created their own rituals, softer and invisible. One of the most common private beliefs was that the soul, upon death, became air. Not wind, which was restless and loud, but air the kind that lingers in closed rooms or rests gently on the cheek in early morning. Some concubines left their windows open slightly each night, even in winter, believing this would guide any wandering soul to rest. Others whispered into bowls of water before sleep, murmuring names or half-remembered prayers, letting the water carry the sound into stillness. They believed this gave peace to those who had no graves. Some concubines carried small talisman slips of paper tucked into the hems of their robes, beads sewn beneath collars, bits of old fabric from the homes they once knew. These were not powerful in any mystical sense, but they held memory. And in memory, they believed, the spirit anchored. One man was known for carving a tiny lotus into the back of each comb he used. When asked why, he said, "So that I may be reborn with better hair." It was said with a smile, but the hope beneath it was real. Rebirth was a comforting idea. Many believed they would return as birds' cranes, especially with long legs and wide wings, free to move across the skies. Others hoped to return as musicians, allowed to play whatever they pleased. A few, more grounded, hoped simply to return as men with names and families who remembered them. But whatever form it took, rebirth was always imagined as a life with more voice, more space, more sky. There were quiet rituals for death, too. If a concubine died within the palace walls, which did happen, though it was rarely spoken of others followed certain unspoken practices. They would sweep his room 3 times instead of once. They would place a piece of uncut fruit on his table, then leave it untouched for 3 days. Some would place a hand mirror on his pillow, face down, to keep his spirit from getting trapped. If a comb was left behind, they would snap one tooth from it and bury it in a flower pot. These gestures had no official meaning, but among the concubines, they were sacred. And the most personal ritual of all was the offering of breath. It happened in solitude. A concubine would sit cross-legged in his chamber, close his eyes, and exhale slowly while thinking of the departed. A breath, they believed, carried memory, and by offering it freely, they gave part of themselves to the one who had passed. One concubine wrote in a hidden journal, "I do not fear death, only being unremembered. Let my breath be the lantern." Someone else carries. Temples were rarely visited, but often imagined. Some spoke of a temple of quiet faces, where every concubine who had ever lived had their likeness carved in mist. Others believed in a forest beyond the world where discarded names blossomed into flowers. One concubine imagined a mountain, covered in mirrors, each reflecting the soul as it truly was, not painted, not bowed, not renamed. In their dreams, they returned to these places often. The spirit world became a realm of repair, of reunions with the lost, of speech without punishment, of touch without consequence. They did not fear spirits that many concubines hoped they would. Be haunted just to feel close again to someone they had loved. A whisper of a name during sleep, a door closing with no breeze, the sudden scent of plum blossom in winter. These were not frightening. They were gifts. Some concubines believed that each object held a spirit fragment. A bowl, if used long. Enough remembered the warmth of the hands that held it. A robe, worn nightly, carried the shape of the body it covered. When a concubine was removed or passed on, those left behind treated his things with reverence. Even the way they folded his bedding became a kind of funeral, right tight corners, smoothed edges, a final press of the palm in the center. Occasionally, if someone was especially missed, they would write his name on rice paper, dissolve it in tea, and drink it. It was called the remembering swallow. They said it helped the soul travel safely. The imperial court did not notice these rituals, or if it did, it chose to ignore them. The concubines' spiritual lives remained folded in shadows, stitched, beneath ceremony, carried in breath and silence. But they endured, and perhaps that was their most powerful resistance, not to rise against the palace with fire or cry, but to honor their own with dignity, to carry each other forward in memory, breath and belief, and belief. Legacy within the Forbidden City did not rise in statues or scrolls for those like the male concubines. No portraits hung for them in the ancestral halls. No names were etched in stone. And yet, something of them endured, not in the eyes of history, but in the rhythm of rooms, in the shape of rituals quietly handed down, and in the way one body mirrored another without ever being told to. Their legacy moved like breath unclaimed, unowned, but everywhere. One learned not by instruction, but by observation. A new concubine entering the inner quarters for the first time would not receive a manual. Instead, he would be watched and gently nudged by invisible gestures. If he folded his robe too stiffly, someone nearby might pause in their own task, refold their own robe more softly, and wait for him to notice. If he placed a tea bowl too far from the edge, someone else might slide it closer to the shadow line, on the table, and not explain. In this way, a silent lineage stretched across generations of those who were never supposed to matter. What they inherited was not authority, but attentiveness. The way a window was opened halfway to let in the right kind of light for morning sweeping. The exact number of steps it took to walk from the basin to the mat without spilling water. The use of a fingertip to test if the oil lamp was too hot to move. These were passed down with no names attached to them. One concubine might whisper, "This is how Reed Whisper did it," referring to a man gone for 10 years. Another might say nothing at all, merely mimicking the bend of a wrist that he had once seen and had never forgotten. Imitation, in this world, was preservation. Some gestures became sacred. The way one bowed at the emperor's chamber door 5 degrees deeper than required was known to have originated from a concubine who once saved the emperor's favorite cup from falling. The bow became a quiet homage, passed on long after the story itself was forgotten. In this way, legacy lived in curvature and breath, not in memory's bright spotlight, but in its gentle corners. There were objects, too, that carried these. Inheritances. A comb smoothed with use, always left at the left edge of the wash basin. A fan whose paper had been replaced many times, but whose handle bore the dents of long fingers. A robe stitched with a pattern no longer fashionable, but kept because it reminded someone of a softness now gone. These items were not labeled, but their presence was understood. A concubine once said, "He is still here in the way this bowl tilts." And everyone knew what he meant. Songs, even without words, survived this way. A melody hummed during nighttime folding. A tapping pattern on the rim of a tray that once belonged to a long-departed hand. The new ones picked it up without realizing. Their fingers followed the rhythm, and only later did someone say, "That was Night Song. We all hum it, though no one remembers who began it." There were stories, too. Not official ones, but tales passed in hushes. Of a concubine who painted a plum blossom on his inner robe lining each day for a month, and then sewed them all into a pillow. Of one who refused to speak for 7 days. After his friend was reassigned and communicated only in the arrangement of his teacups. These stories were rarely told in full. They were passed like river stones, smoothed, abbreviated, sometimes distorted, but heavy with meaning. Even if the names were lost, the gestures remained. Legacy also moved in silence. If a certain room was avoided during twilight, or if no one sat in a particular corner during meal breaks, it was often because someone long ago had wept there, or whispered something unforgettable. New concubines would notice, ask nothing, and adopt the habit. In time, they would pass it to others. This chain of silence was unbroken and revered. There were days set aside, unofficially, to remember the unremembered. One such day, known among them only as the Day of Threads, came once each season. On that day, concubines would wear a single loose thread on their robes, not tied, not trimmed. It dangled, subtle and easy to miss. It meant, I am carrying someone with me today. No names were spoken, no glances exchanged, but in the stillness of sweeping or walking or tea brewing, the threads moved and everyone knew. When someone passed through the ranks, quickly rising in favor, then falling, his legacy was marked by gestures of caution. The way his former friends looked away when passing his chamber, the way his routines were studied and then quietly avoided. Others, however, left traces of gentleness, a favored way of arranging flowers, a method for folding napkins into birds. These things were continued not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. To continue a gesture was to say, he made this moment kinder. And kindness, in a place of such strict control, was a rare inheritance. Perhaps the most intimate form of legacy came through touch, not in the romantic sense, which was rare and dangerous, but in the brushing of sleeves, in the shared lifting of a heavy object, in the way two bodies bent over a water basin at the same angle. These mirrored movements built bonds. When one left, the other might continue the motion alone for a while, as if echoing the partnership long after the voice was gone. Over time, the concubines came to understand that their value did not lie in being remembered publicly, but in being carried quietly forward. They did not expect statues, but they knew that when a new arrival folded his sleeping mat with the same final press in the center, someone else had survived. Aging inside this forbidden city was a quiet erosion, not sudden but slow, like a stone basin growing smoother with each ladle of water. For the male concubines, growing old was not marked by celebration or recognition. There were no birthdays whispered in their name, no golden ceremonies, no promotions to honor seniority. Instead, aging arrived gently in the body first, and then in the tasks that were slowly taken away. It crept in when a concubine could no longer kneel with perfect posture for an hour, or when his hands began to tremble just slightly while pouring the emperor's tea. No one said anything at first. The shift was polite, gradual. A younger concubine might begin performing his duties just for practice. He would smile, perhaps bow too low in apology, and the older man would nod, accepting the transfer of ritual. But beneath the surface of this courtesy lived a quiet grief. The older concubines were not cast out. There was no formal expulsion, but their roles became lighter, their steps slower, their names less often spoken. And in a palace that prized precision, youth, and silence, to fade was to become part of the furniture present, useful still, but no longer seen. Some adjusted with grace. They found peace in slower duties, folding laundry, organizing combs, arranging cushions. These tasks, while mundane, carried their own dignity. In them, the body still remembered its purpose. One concubine, who had once been known for his elegance in dance, spent his final years sweeping the same corridor each morning, not because he had to, but because the rhythm soothed him. Each sweep was a remembered step, each motion a choreography. Others struggled more. They watched their former peers taken to quieter corners or sent to distant pavilions, no longer summoned by name, but by duty code. The laughter grew quieter, the evenings longer. In some corners of the concubine quarters, there were men whose faces few could name, too old to be recognized by the younger ones, too invisible to be remembered by the staff. They became stories, then shadows. Some aged men spoke little. Their words became slow, sparse, like lanterns lit only during stormy nights. They were consulted, when needed often, for how to fold a robe properly or how to navigate a particularly delicate protocol, but otherwise left to their silence. That silence, however, was filled with texture. It held memories of hundreds of rituals, thousands of warnings, the sound of hundreds of footsteps on polished tile. Aging brought with it a deeper connection to the quiet itself. Younger concubines, if they were wise, learned to sit near the older ones during rest periods, not to talk, but to observe. The old men did not teach directly, but their movements carried entire philosophies. The way one places a spoon with exact weight and distance from a bowl. The way he tied the sash of his robe in one fluid motion, not for display, but because his hands remembered. These were gestures of accumulated life, not performed for anyone, yet richer than any page in a record book. The physical body, of course, began to yield. Knees stiffened, hair thinned, backs curved, but even this decline became ritualized. Some concubines took pride in grooming one another, anointing aching joints with warm oil, combing silver strands with slow reverence, wrapping swollen feet with cloth soaked in chrysanthemum water. These were not acts of pity, but of care, acknowledgement, love disguised as habit. It was said that a truly respected elder never asked for help. The others simply arrived with hot tea, a folded shawl, or a shared glance. Sleep became different. 2. Older concubines often woke before dawn, not because of duty, but because their dreams ended earlier. They sat by the windows, watching the sky change, listening to the palace breathe. These moments became their own kind of prayer. No incense, no chants, just breath and light and the slow rise of morning. Some had small rituals thinly they understood. One elder rubbed his thumb against the same jade bead every morning before speaking. Another took exactly 9 sips of tea before touching anything else. These acts weren't superstition. They were memory anchors ways to affirm that despite fading visibility, the self still remained. The body might age, but routine preserved identity. In rare moments, aging concubines were given quiet honors. A younger man might imitate their bow style or arrange a tray in the exact angle they had favored. These subtle echoes served as offerings, unspoken acknowledgments that this man, though graying and forgotten, had shaped the present. In this way, legacy lived not in stories, but in repetition. Even humor aged differently. Where young concubines joked in whispers and sideways glances, the elders smiled with their eyes alone. A raised eyebrow, a shared sigh, a slightly exaggerated yawn, these became their language. And occasionally, during moments of unexpected gentleness, they would laugh. Not loud, not long, but with a warmth that filled the space like sun through silk. Some, nearing the end of their lives, requested no ceremony. They asked only for a favorite scent: jasmine, sandalwood, rain-damp linen, a particular pillow, a quiet room. And sometimes they did not ask at all. They simply slept longer. Each day, until one morning they did not wake. The others would know. A bowl left untouched, a robe not moved, and the room would pause for a moment, breath held before returning to its rhythm. The concubine was gone, but not erased. His steps still echoed faintly. His habits remained in the corners. His silence, once unnoticed, became a remembered presence. To leave the palace was not freedom, it was dislocation. For the very few male concubines who were permitted to exit the Forbidden City's labyrinth of jade and silence, the outside world did not arrive as open sky or wild laughter, but as overwhelming noise. It wasn't the roar of chaos they faced, but the hum of unpredictability, the scent of unfamiliar streets, the creak of doors they had never touched, the way dust moved when not swept by royal rhythm. Most never left. The system was designed to hold, to hush, to contain. But in rare circumstances, old age, illness, political reshuffling, or a favor repaid quietly, some were released into a world they had only glimpsed in dreams or memory. Fragments. And the moment their soft shoes met stone beyond the final courtyard, they entered a new kind of invisibility. For years, their worth had been in their precision, their silence, their vanishing presence among gold leaf and silk folds. Outside, that vanished role became a burden. Who were they now? They had no surname, no trade, no coin. Many had not seen a market since boyhood, nor touched a tree that had not been trimmed by palace gardeners. Even the sun, now unfiltered by. Carved wooden screens seemed too bright. The sky looked too large, the air too loud. Some wept at the sound of open wind. Some stood still for hours, unable to walk without a path designed for them. There are records whispers in the margins of old household documents, of former concubines arriving at temples, dressed in outdated robes, asking only for a place to sweep the floor. Others were found by riverbanks, dipping their hands in water as if to remind themselves that it flowed without permission. A few found work in tea houses, serving silently, their movements oddly graceful, their eyes distant. Patrons would sometimes ask, "Where did you learn to pour like that?" And they would reply, "In a place that no longer remembers me." One story, preserved in the oral tradition of a small southern village, tells of an old man who settled at the edge of town, living in a single-room house lined with dried petals and pressed cloth. He never gave his name. Children said he moved like a whisper. He never raised his voice. Every morning, he arranged flowers into bowls, not vases, and placed them on his windowsill. When asked why, he said, "This is how I remember those who forgot me." It is believed he was once a concubine. He died with no ceremony, but the villagers continued the flower ritual in his honor. Freedom, for these men, came with no instruction. They knew how to fold robes perfectly, but not how to sew for themselves. They knew how to apply makeup and oils, but not how to mend roofs or build fires. Some traded these palace skills to survive. One became a fortune teller, using his deep understanding of court cycles to predict local fortunes. Another became a dance teacher to merchant daughters, passing down the palace's silent art of movement. But others disappeared entirely, fading into alleys, vanishing beneath bridges, their gestures too refined for peasant life, their past too dangerous to name aloud. The emotional burden of re-entry was immense. Years, even decades, of ritualized silence, of forbidden desire, of erased identity, left deep internal scarring. Some concubines developed strange habits, combing their hair exactly 23 times each morning, whispering names into bowls of tea, refusing to sleep unless all shoes were facing the same direction. To the outside world, these were eccentricities. But inside, they were anchors rituals clung to like driftwood in a flood. They missed the palace not for its splendor, but for its rhythm, the predictability, the certainty of being needed, even if only for silent company. One former concubine wrote in a rare letter discovered centuries later, "Out here, I speak and no one listens. In there, I did not speak, but someone always noticed." There were moments of beauty too. First rains without a roof echoing, over lacquer, the freedom to walk without waiting for a bell, a bowl of noodles eaten with both hands, laughter that did not need to be stifled. Some learned to sing again, not the delicate flute melodies of the palace, but songs from childhood, from villages long forgotten. Their voices cracked, but they sang. In certain provinces, a quiet custom emerged: older men lighting paper lanterns on the 7th day of the 7th lunar month, setting them afloat on rivers. No names were spoken, but the villagers called them memory lanterns. They said they were for the men who had returned without home, without title, without family. The lanterns floated until they sank. Some former concubines found kinship in each other, forming small, unofficial circles. In hidden rooms behind tea shops or temples, they would meet not to mourn, but to exist without explanation. They sat, combed each other's hair, hummed old melodies. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they simply breathed. In one known case, a pair of retired concubines built a small garden together. Nothing grand, just moss, stone, water. But they tended it daily, naming each rock after a lost friend, each flower after a memory. They called it the Garden of Soft Things. No visitors were allowed, and when they died, the neighbors left the garden untouched. The idea of starting over, of building a self, after being trained to erase it, was both terrifying and sacred. Some succeeded, others drifted, but all of them carried a ghost of the palace in their steps, in the way they held cups, in the way they listened without interrupting. And somewhere in the corners of the world, if you find an old man arranging flowers in bowls, or folding cloth with too much care, you might be looking at someone who once lived behind screens, who once walked in silence, who once bore the weight of being seen and never truly known. Perhaps by now your eyes have grown heavy. Perhaps you've already drifted into the space between one breath and the next, where time doesn't tick, but floats. And if you're still here, awake in the gentle hush of this moment, then allow this final thread of the story to unfold around you like a silk robe in candlelight. We began with a whisper, and we will end with one. The life of a male concubine in ancient China was never about glory. It was never meant to be remembered. There were no grand tombs, no soaring poems. But across the arc of everything we've walked through training and erasure, silence and memory, touch and breath, one thing remains quietly radiant: the persistence of presence. In a world designed to forget them, they remembered each other. In rituals too soft for history books, in moments too quiet for ink, they carved out a space where identity could fold itself, like cloth hidden but intact. The palace itself absorbed them. If you were to walk the stones of the Forbidden City today, you might not see their names etched anywhere. But if you paid attention, the way they did, you might feel them in the way the light lands in an unused corridor, or how a door, left ajar, breathes just slightly in the wind. Their legacy is not a statue, but a rhythm. Not a monument, but a gesture. A comb turned just so on a wooden table. A curtain tied with a forgotten knot. The memory of a voice never raised. The passing down of a smile, so faint it becomes prayer. In the final years of one concubine's life, he was said to have whispered into his mirror each morning, "Today I will be still, and still I will be me." That is the quiet defiance of their existence, not to shout into history, but to hold shape in silence. In their world, intimacy was not loud. Love was not declared. Grief was not shared in public. And yet, in the brush of a hand, the pressing of a robe's final fold, the glance held half a second too long, they lived fully. They mourned with grace. They touched without claim. They were not blank spaces. They were calligraphy written in water. If you listen closely, even now, you might hear the echo of their days, the sweep of a broom at dawn, the sound of a tea bowl being set down without clatter, the soft exhale before a name is swallowed forever. This story has carried you through chambers rarely visited. You followed the invisible path of men whose lives floated just below the surface of imperial splendor. And now, As we prepare to part, perhaps you carry a piece of them with you, not in grief, but in gentleness. Maybe you will notice the way your hand smooths a bedsheet before sleep, or how silence fills a room like warm light, or how a single breath can hold a lifetime. That is how they endure, not as history, but as stillness, not as fame, but as memory shaped by gesture. If your eyes are closed now, then rest easy. You are surrounded by the softest echoes of lives that asked only to be felt, not known. And if you're still listening, gently awake, thank you for walking with us through this fragile and sacred world. We've wandered across lacquered floors and garden shadows, through loss and ritual, quiet rebellion, and quiet love. We've traced the curve of time through hands trained not to tremble, and hearts trained not to speak. But in the end, silence remembers everything. Before you sleep, if you'd like, press your palm gently against your chest and breathe in. That's all they ever did, hold memory through breath. Perhaps now you understand why. If you found this journey soothing, do subscribe to our channel. Let us know where you're listening from. London? Some room wrapped in shadows and warmth? Other stories are waiting. Other lives you haven't met yet. Until then, let your sleep be peaceful. Let your dreams be soft. And remember, sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones spoken only in a whisper.